here to talk about my favorite thing, prescribed fire liability. I've been talking about this a lot. Apparently, there aren't a lot of people who decided that they're really excited about statutes in the world. Go figure. But I'm one of those. So, so I'm going to kind of go through why we have prescribed fire statutes real quickly, talk about Pennsylvania's a bit, what it means for you all, and some of the components of it that are kind of the lesser known pieces of that fall into place. And then hopefully I'll have a little bit of time to talk about insurance, because I heard from the grapevine that y'all are pretty interested in insurance. I didn't make slides, but I can speak on it and share that information in a presentation form to get out to you guys later. So kind of where do we get this prescribed fire acts? These were not around before the 90s. They didn't exist. Basically, prescribed fire was legislated as in criminal acts where you couldn't burn, burning was arson, open burning was illegal. And we didn't have a lot of laws other than those that would kind of help us think about what's going to happen to us if prescribed fire escapes. We especially didn't have a lot of civil law guidance, and most of it was governed by the courts. And so common law was in place where it was governed the same way as all kind of property damage or personal injury law was. And then around the time of 1990, we have this, what I refer to as the rise of the right to burn. So, and it started in my current state of Florida, where we had a particularly bad, damaging fire year, where we had a lot of smoke in the road with a lot of smoke-related accidents. We had a lot of properties burned up from a very bad wildfire year, and it was a very large drought, and there was very little that could be done to control it because people noted that we had an excessive fuel buildup, and we hadn't been maintaining those fuels at levels where it was reasonable to control wildfires during particularly bad fire weather. And so in October of 1991, this court ruling came out. It was a private landowner and his contract burner were taken to court because they caused an accident in the road because their smoke went over the road. And the courts used some pretty terrible language in there when they found both the contractor and the landowner, who had no knowledge of prescribed burning whatsoever and just contracted someone else to do it, liable for this accident. And they said there, it's equally self-evident that smoke blowing across a heavily traveled traffic corridor possesses a dangerous propensity. And it said, because setting a fire was clearly a dangerous agency, it possessed dangerous properties, then these people were liable. And so that's sounding like any fire that gets lit that escapes, you're going to be liable for either penalty damages from burning neighbor's property or personal injury or smoke accidents. And so this was really concerning to the people who were doing a lot of burning in Florida at the time, because they saw what was in the pipeline, where more droughts were potentially going to happen, and they weren't getting enough fuels management done. And so there was a big push at this time. The Florida Forest Service, along with others who were doing burning, got together, found a senator to support a prescribed fire piece of legislation, and created the first prescribed fire statute. And so at the time, that was 1990, and then they made some modifications, adding a certified prescribed burn manager program and changing liability, which I'll talk about in a little more detail later on in this presentation, in 1999. And so that was the first time we had statutorily prescribed right to burn. So that they set aside, kind of in the language from the legislator, what will you be liable for if a fire escapes? Why do we want to set this out, and all the things that come along with your prescribed fire acts? And so these are kind of the pieces, these things that come along with your prescribed fire statutes. They codify the right of a landowner to burn, and I'll show examples of each of these in the upcoming slides. So they establish that liability standard that I talked about. I'll go into a lot of detail on that. Establish your certified prescribed burn manager programs, incentivize that certification sometimes, and then establish the regulatory requirements that the state will have for you to burn. So we're going to talk about this first, codifying the right to burn, because it's really important and it's often overlooked. People think about this prefatory language in a statute as just being kind of, oh, we jump through that and go down to where the meat of the rules are. But this stuff comes in play when you go to court. And so we've seen in a lot of cases, and at the end of this presentation, I'll have a QR code If you're interested in looking at some prescribed fire cases that have gone through through the courts, and there's record of them because they went to a court of appeals, that's all put together in a nice document, but only for the Southwestern United States. So we do need to have a broader document like this for the rest of the country. But if you're interested in seeing how those play out, click on that QR or take a picture of that QR code at the end and you can see that document. But basically what these right to burn acts do is they say it's a landowner's right to burn. You own land, you have the right to burn it. And that's important because courts look at what the legislature intended when they go to decide a case. So they can look at this preparatory language that establishes the right to burn, and they say, and that they also establish why the legislature thinks it's important that people have the right to burn. And the judges will use that in their decision making. And so what do these look like? So this is the Prescribed Burning Practices Act. Those of you that have been through the Certified Prescribed Burn Manager training have probably seen this a few times, but I've highlighted here some of the big important components. So basically it declares that prescribed burning is a land management tool that benefits the state, and therefore it is important. It goes on to describe what it does. So all of the underlying text here, naturally occurring vegetation, fuels are reduced, so fire safety, maintaining specific resource values, and removing undesirable plant species. All these things we talked about all day today is why you guys burn. So all of that's in your statute. And this is continued. There's even more in there. There's so much in there. And so one of the neat things that Pennsylvania's does that not a lot of them do is to that number 7 there, where they say the development and urbanization is happening, and we realize there's this issue between burning and people breathing clean air, and people who aren't burners not realizing why we're burning. And so there can be liability issues that come up as a result of that. That's why it's important that we have this statute. So that sets out for courts when people come in with a case and they say, this guy burned his property and it burned my house, and even if he did it all right, and then the courts can look to this language and say, how are we going to try this case given the statutory language where they're trying to promote prescribed burning? And then really nice thing that Pennsylvania did was pull that purpose out and summarize it in like the Cliff Notes version. So that gives the courts just like this bullet point of, okay, this is what the legislature intended when they created this act. The liability standards are the meat of these acts. Basically, before these acts, no one knew when you were going to face a judge because your fire escaped and your neighbor's barn burned down and he was taking you to court. Nobody knew how they were going to be adjudged. They weren't sure what the standards were. They didn't know what they were up against, and it was very variable from court to court. So this certified prescribed, or the statutory burn acts, create this liability standard. It's in there, it's listed. The courts know they have to apply that. They instruct juries to apply that. And you guys, the burners, know that's what's going to be applied in your case when, if heaven forbid, you have to go to court. And this is really important because we've done lots and lots and lots of social science in lots of areas all across the country, looking at prescribed burning, what stops people from burning. Number one answer every time is liability, that fear of escape and being liable for the results. And this is just kind of a overview of some research that we did in the Great Plains, where we looked at a lot of different landowners, different types of landowners, and why they used or didn't use prescribed fire. And you see that came out, that general personal liability came out at the top all the time as being really important in their answers as to why they don't burn. And we did kind of a review because we were curious as this was happening everywhere. And so this is a review of all of the literature of social science that have been done. And we see it time and time again, this social component of liability rising to the top. But there are lots of other components of why people don't burn that come into play too. So it's not the only reason, but it's definitely one of the driving forces. So what do I mean when I say liability? So liability are the standards that are applied. So it describes the duty of care that you as a burner owes the general public when you conduct your burn. And that duty of care is what the courts will hold you to if an escape happens and damages occur or personal injury occurs. So the states all have different liability standards as either expressed by their statutes, or if they don't have it expressed in a statute, then it tends to fall under what we call common law, and that's typically this simple negligence standard, which is the second one I'll talk about. So the first one is strict liability. Unfortunately, very few states have that. So strict liability is kind of that language that we saw in the court case that I put up at the beginning, where fire is inherently dangerous, and therefore, if you use fire and it escapes, it doesn't matter how you acted, you will be liable for that escape. And so that is, it's regardless of whatever types of behavior you're taking, whether you're certified or not, whether you've been trained, whether you had the appropriate number of people, it doesn't matter. They're not going to look at that. If you let a fire get out, you are responsible. And there used to be a lot more states that had strict liability, and a lot of the ones that had strict liability were the ones that decided to move forward with these statutes that changed that liability to simple negligence, which is by far and large what most of our states have, either statutorily prescribed, and that's the light purple states, or undefined, and that's the white states. And we assume that simple negligence is being applied there because that's typical for all personal injury and property damage cases. And that just means the duty of care that is owed is that it requires the burner to practice the reasonable care in applying prescribed burns that other burners similarly situated would do. So what is reasonable for the profession of burning? And that's what the courts would apply and instruct a jury to apply. Did the burner do what was reasonable? Now, as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of differences in opinion as to what's reasonable for burners in Pennsylvania if there were to come to a jury of some of your peers, maybe some people who don't know anything about fire. So it can be pretty dicey when you have simple negligence, which is what you have here. And then some states, realizing that this liability thing was a real hindrance and really wanting to get a lot more burning done, went with a gross negligence standard in their prescribed fire statutes. And gross negligence is pretty much the Cadillac of liability standards. The degree of care owed is very low in those cases, and the courts will instruct the jury to apply that standard. And so if a burner follows the code, so there's usually some kind of statutory mandated things that they need to do to attain the gross negligence standard, such as becoming certified. So most states, except for Georgia, require you to be certified to get the gross negligence level. If you're not certified, it'll be simple negligence. But Georgia allows gross negligence for everyone. But basically, if you follow those statutorily described regulations, getting certified, Florida says you have to have adequate fire breaks and personnel, then the plaintiff must show that you were having reckless disregard or basically acting wantonly. So almost to the level of you were actively avoiding doing anything careful on this fire. And that it's a very hard standard for a plaintiff to show. And one of the big things is the plaintiff is the one who has to show that, either simple or gross negligence. So if they don't bring enough evidence, then the courts won't even let that go to a jury. And so when that QR code comes up at the end, you can see the cases that came out of states with gross negligence. So Georgia, I think, has 3. Florida has 1 in there. They show every time that the judge, he passed what they call summary judgment, which means the jury never even saw the case. The judge said there was insufficient evidence to prove any type of gross negligence. Often there's language in those cases that says, if it were simple negligence, we would have sent it to the jury. But because the statute says gross negligence, and we know why the legislature wants this, they want to promote prescribed burning, it's in their preparatory language, we're not going to send it to the jury. Now, that's not to say that this is going to be the case every time. We all know that the law is has a lot of vagaries, and they'll take you to court, of course, anyone will, but whether or not the judge actually follows this hasn't been tested in a lot of places. Oftentimes, you'll either have insurance that settles for you, it'll get settled out of court. So we don't have a lot of cases that actually get to courts where we can point to them and say, this is what the judge did. And once they get there, that's precedent that future judges have to follow, but they just don't often get there, which is probably very fortunate. But so there's not a lot of absolutes when it comes to the law, unfortunately. And so just really quickly, some research that I did back in 2015, I was curious. So if we're really trying to promote prescribed burning with this gross negligence standard, that's lower liability, is it helping? Are we promoting prescribed fire? So I looked at the states that had it at the time, which was Georgia, Florida, and then compared them to their neighbors right across the borders, and just looked at those bordering counties because, you know, all sorts of other things would determine how much people are burning in a given state. But right at those county borders, the weather should be the same, the types of fuels there should be the same, all of that in proximity to each other should be pretty similar. The only thing that's different is you're in one state versus another, which has different laws. So we looked at that to see, are we burning more in gross negligence states than simple negligence states? And this is only on prescribed fires on private lands. So we didn't look at agency differences because that adds a whole new layer of rules, regulations, and all sorts of differences. And we did see, in fact, that there were quite a few more acres in the gross negligence states than in simple negligence states, and quite a few more fires burned every year in those states. And this might not look like that big of a difference. You see the percentage of land area burned jumps up a little bit, not too much. But if we actually extrapolate out to what this means as far as acreage goes, this little 2% increase in burning that we saw for just these counties that were part of my study, the green part over here in Alabama, that included 7 million acres. So a 2% increase in that would be almost 150,000 more acres burned every year. So there are additional tools for limiting liability. Since you have simple negligence here, doesn't mean you in the future couldn't put forth some amendments to your legislation to try and get gross negligence, but that requires a perfect storm of things to get going. But what else could we do to limit our liability? So a few states have developed what they kind of colloquially refer to as catastrophe funds. California has a pilot one right now, and Washington State has just developed one. And the monies can come from various places. I think California took it from their tax base. Washington, I'm not sure where their money came from, but it can be from reinsurance. It can be from certified prescribed burn manager fees that you have to pay to get certified. Basically, what it does is it creates a public fund because the prescribed burning is viewed as a public good. We read that in all of our preparatory language. Then why shouldn't the public pay for it? And so what they do is they create a public fund where if a landowner is brought to court because he's had an escaped prescribed fire, then damages were found, then this catastrophe fund would cover his damages. And right now, there's limits on them. So California's pilot program is cut at $20 million a year. So you can imagine how quickly damages would rack up in places like California. And so they're not going to be able to potentially cover huge damages or a whole lot of landowners in a year. But so far, they haven't even come close to touching what's in that catastrophe fund. But they won't even go through the court case or have to go through the court case or figure anything out. They'll just settle with the catastrophe funds paying the settlement. And so that's one way to do it. Liability limits is another thing that people have been looking at. Nebraska attempted to put prescribed fire statutes through recently, and they were looking for both gross negligence and they wanted a liability limit, which basically means that yes, you might be liable for an escaped prescribed fire if you were found grossly negligent, or if they ended up with simple negligence, if you were found simply negligent, you could be liable, but you're only going to be liable up to, and I think their cap was $150,000 in damages. So you won't have to be as concerned about these big ticket damage items that won't be covered by your insurance or otherwise. And then private insurance. I've been talking about insurance a lot. So private insurance is the other way, the additional way to limit liability besides having it built into your state statute. And in simple negligence states and in gross negligence states recently, it's become really important for people, they feel, to have insurance, to have their assets covered. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of availability of insurance and it's very variable. So I have some old data that I'm going to share with you. And I will print this up in a nice format and share it with folks to get out to you because I don't have slides on it. I didn't want to present them because they are older. So it was a survey that was conducted by Jennifer Fawcett at North Carolina State. And she surveyed bunches of people in all throughout the Southeast to see where they were getting their insurance from, and then asked them a bunch of questions about their insurance. And so it's not extensive across the whole country. I'll point to a few that I know are, but she found only 6 at that time insurers insured across the Southeast. And of those 6, I Googled, since 3 have disappeared as insurers, so they're no longer offering any insurance. And then 4 of them still offered, or 3 of them still offered insurance. And then there's a new one that's come up that I'm aware of. So there's Conservation United, and they're kind of a global or a national thing, and they offer policies, but they offer policies at the hefty price of $5,000 a year. And that's your general liability and your prescribed fire liability. And it covers up to $1 million in damages. But if you're just a single person trying to burn your own land, you're not going to pay $5,000. You're not going to be able to pay $5,000 a year to be covered. So they've reached out to me and they want to know, why aren't people buying this product? Oh, it costs a little prohibitive. They say that's what it costs to underwrite it, but I don't know how all that works. So there's that one. Assured Partners and Outdoor Underwriters are 2 that also are currently offering, and I believe they offer nationally, but you have to look into them and see. And then one that I know for sure offers nationally is Forestry Specialty, but they are only offering group programs to prescribed burn associations. They aren't offering individual policies. So if you have a prescribed burn association and you can afford their coverage, which I'm not sure the exact price, but I do know the Southwest Georgia Prescribed Burn Association just bought their coverage for a couple years for around $100,000, but they got grants to do it because they were able to get grants as a prescribed burn association to cover a lot of the cost. And Tall Timbers pitched in a lot of money to get it too. And that covers all the burners in the prescribed burn association. So just a few notes there. These things range in cost. I've seen some that offer individual fire. So you don't buy for a whole year, you just buy per burn at $250. That was about the lowest you could find for an individual fire. That ranges up to like $2,500 per fire. And then annual cost ranged from around $2,000, which is pretty high still, to $250,000. So it can be astronomical. But there's a big range, and different insurance companies offer different types of insurance. And then, so think about that annual versus per burn, just depends on how much you're burning. And then there's deductibles on some, as with all insurance. Some of them had none, some of them had like a $5,000 deductible. And that deductible only applies if you have an escape that they have to cover. And they range in coverage from 100,000 to about $1 million per occurrence of escape, and 100,000 to 200,000 aggregate over the year. So a lot of ranging going on in there. So yeah, just some considerations on those. Some of them are contractor only. Some of them also insure private burners. Some of them are group, like the Prescribed Burn Association. Some are individual also. So lots of variability. I'll send out what we know, but there's lots we don't know. So a good thing to look into for the Fire Council, and Todd said he was doing it sometime soon, is who offers it and for what costs and what's available to you all. Okay. So these are your liability standards. So the big important thing is what are we subject to here? So I said already, you have a simple negligence standard, and that means that you must do that reasonable care. Like you have to have acted with reasonable care, and that's going to be determined by the court. And a lot of times, if it goes to court, it will be determined by a jury. So basically, if there's evidence that showed that you were negligent in some regard in lighting your fire or in controlling your fire, then it's perceivable that a jury could find you guilty for civil liability. However, your statute states there will be no criminal penalties or civil penalties unless you're negligent. So negligence has to be shown for civil or criminal penalties. And so just a note here, this is the exact language of the statute, which you can read, that shows simple negligence must be proven for someone to recover damages against you. But it applies also to a property owner who contracts. So the property owner could potentially be liable, but if they contract it out and the contractor is not negligent, then the owner will not be found negligent. And then also, no one who acts under the direction of the prescribed burner as well. So all the crew so your burn boss could be liable, but will only be liable with negligence. And then your crew could be liable, but not without negligence. So probably some questions on that. I'll try and run through the rest of this so there's plenty of time for questions. So the other thing that these right to burn acts do is establish your certified prescribed burn manager program. A lot of you have probably gone through that and you know what the burn manager program is. Those basically, so this is kind of a list that's a little dated now, maybe 4 years old, of the states that have those. I know we've added some since then, but they vary as to what's going to be, they vary as to what's going to be required for certified prescribed burn management. And one thing that we've seen in creating these certification standards is some are really rigorous. So like Colorado requires NWCG RxB1 kind of levels. And that's pretty rough. So you'd have to go out on wildland fires to get that textbook signed up on. So we see in Colorado right now, there are only 20 burner Bs, which are certified burn pile burners, and then 5 burner As, which is moderate complexity broadcast burning. Florida has a pretty straightforward, pretty easy certification program, I would say, 5 days of class, and you don't have to do any NWCG type things. And so they have currently 1,700 certified prescribed burn managers enrolled and 1,200 certified pile burners. So you can see how that difference in what you're going to require the managers to do in their training is going to make a big difference in how much uptake you'll have of your burn management program. And there is wiggle room with that. It's not statutorily prescribed. It's decided upon by the group that handles fire in your state. So it can be changed and it can be altered. If you're not seeing enrollment, you can make some changes in that. And so basically the reason they think these differences are happening is that there are different goals. So in Colorado, they want to increase the public perception of fire. They have a bad negative rap on fire. And so they said they're just going to start out with this really rigorous one so they can show, look how safe we're being. And then once they get the public on board, they'll loosen those standards. We'll see if that happens or not. But in places like Florida and Georgia with those gross negligence standards, they just really want to promote burning. So they make their certification program a little more lenient. And finally, the incentivization of that certification is pretty important. So the liability protection is the biggest one. So different states have incentivized different portions of that. For instance, South Carolina allows for gross negligence standard to be applied in the case of smoke-related accidents, but not fire-related accidents. They didn't start with that. They originally had all simple negligence and then made that amendment a few years ago for smoke. And so basically the liability will only apply to certified prescribed burn managers if a smoke-related accident occurs. California has gross negligence for suppression costs, and that only applies to certified prescribed burn manager. So when CAL FIRE gets called out to the site, although a burner could be liable in a civil court to damages for their neighbors and have to pay for that under simple negligence, plaintiff will have to show that they were, and the plaintiff would be CAL FIRE, would have to show they were grossly negligent in order for them to recover the costs of suppression, which can be pretty substantial. But again, that only extends to certified burners. You have to be certified to get that extra protection. And then in some states, they have that protection for fire, smoke, and suppression costs, like Georgia and Florida. So there are other ways to provide an incentive to certify people. Some states have burn bans put in place all the time, and they can get an exemption from a burn ban if they're certified. Texas has that. Sometimes they can extend hours for burning. There's places where you can't burn past a certain time of day, but certified burners can. Seasonal burn windows are the same. There's places where they just shut down burning for chunks of time, and then certified burners are not under that restriction. And easier for filing for permits is a big one. A lot of places won't allow a certified burn manager just to fill out the electronic form. They'll have to go through a more rigorous process and present a burn plan and all of that. And then certified burners don't have to do that. And finally, the last piece of the puzzle is establishing your regulatory requirements. These vary widely from states, but this is all that is written into Pennsylvania law, is that the burn must be conducted in compliance with a written burn plan under the supervision of a prescribed burn manager. So pretty straightforward. And all of your other regulations and standards are created by the department that oversees fire here. So I wanted to leave time for questions. Hopefully I did. This is the QR code to read about some legal cases if you're interested in seeing how gross negligence played out in courts in the Southeast. And they also have some simple negligence cases in there. You can see how that played out. And it also has a list of all the liability standards, rules, and regulations for those states. Hopefully, at some point in time, we'll be able to expand that to the entire United States. But for now, we have it for the Southeast, and we're working on the rest of the states. So I'll happily take any questions.